Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. I'm back today with the final hand that I'm going to be sharing with you from this $5,000 buy-in World Series of Poker tournament that I final tabled last year. And in this hand, we have 200,000 chips. We are in the money. And I have ace-9 offsuit in the small blind. We're playing 2,000, 4,000. So 50 big blinds. A good tight aggressive kid raises to 9,000 from the cutoff. And with ace-9 in this spot, I'm not going to say it's a mandatory re-raise, but it's pretty close to it. Anytime you get an ace from out of position, you are typically going to want to either call or re-raise. And from the small blind, most of the time you're going to want to be re-raising with all of the hands you plan on playing. And the main reason for that is because you don't want to give the guy in the big blind a great price to call. If the player in the big blind is an extraordinarily weak player, you can call. That's not so bad because you generally want weak players in the pot. But if the player in the big blind is competent or great, you generally want him to fold. So with these hands, particularly ace-x, not an ace with a good kicker, you want to re-raise because a lot of your value is going to come just from making your opponent fold. The fact that you have an ace in your hand makes it way less likely that your opponent can have an ace in his hand, and that's fantastic for you. So I'm going to re-raise this pretty much every time. These are great hands to bluff with. So I make it 25,000, and the good tight aggressive kid calls. I could make it a little bit larger. I want to make it clear. He made it 9. I made it 25. I could have made it a bit bigger to 27 or 30. I think that would be perfectly acceptable. You don't want to make it much smaller than that, though, because then your opponent is going to call every time. And some portion of your value from this pot comes from just making your opponent fold before the flop when he has queen 4 offsuit or something like that and decided to get frisky. So flop comes king, queen, 7. Obviously bad for my hand, but it should be pretty good for my range. This, in general, whenever someone re-raises pre-flop, they tend to have big cards in their hand, and we have 2 very big cards on the flop. So this is pretty good. Of course, this could hit my opponent as well. But I decided to bet. I'm going to be betting here most of the time. I bet 23,000. So remember, I bet 25,000 pre-flop, and now I'm betting a little bit smaller on the flop. This is a spot where you really want to figure out how many streets your opponent will stick around before he starts to play straightforwardly. Some players will play very straightforwardly on the flop, so if he just has nothing, he's going to fold every time. Some players will call the flop every time, or at least with a wide range, like any gut shot or better, and then fold to any turn bet. And then some players will call the flop, call the turn, and then play straightforwardly on the river. I do not remember who this particular player was, but most likely, if I'm betting the 23,000 on the flop, I'm betting that size thinking he's going to call me incredibly wide. So if I think he's going to call me incredibly wide on the flop, I now have to either bet small on the turn with the ideas of betting big on the river, or just make a reasonably sized bet on the turn to hopefully make him fold everything besides a queen or better. So I think what happens in a lot of smaller stakes and middle stakes games is a lot of players just play straightforwardly on the flop right off the bat. So, you know, if they call the flop, you're pretty much done. But as you do move up and play against tougher opponents, they will stick around a little bit longer and put you in pretty tough spots. So the turn is a blank, complete blank. It's a 3. And I bet 37,000 into the 105,000 chip pot. This is a bet that is not particularly large, but notice what it does to our stack sizes. If you go back and watch one of the previous videos from this $5,000 tournament that I made here for Poker News, I talk about sizing bets such that it looks like you're trying to get all in by the river, or such that it makes it to where you could realistically go all in by the river. And if my opponent puts in 37,000, the pot's going to be 180, and we're going to have 115 left. So that's a nice 2/3 pot size bet. I'm not saying I'm going to shove the river, but especially against good players, you want to make it look like you are trying to get in a scenario where you can shove the river, because you have to recognize good players are doing this exact same thing. They realize when you're trying to set up stacks such that you have the opportunity to shove. So I do bet the 37,000, and I imagine in this scenario I was going to be done with it. If he called, I was going to give up. But there are certainly players who I will bet the size on turn and then shove the river. I would probably tend to bet a little bit smaller if I planned on shoving the river as a bluff too often, if I plan on shoving the river often. But this is fine. I mean, this is a spot where by betting the turn, you're making your opponent feel the pressure of your whole stack. And that's a great thing to do. I can put in 37,000, have a great risk-reward ratio, and I think this is going to work a reasonable amount of the time. And if my opponent did call, I was probably going to fold. Or check fold the river. If the river's an ace, I would also just check. I don't think you need to value bet the ace. Your opponent could just easily have ace king, ace queen. I think you're better off checking and seeing what develops. That would be nasty if a river was an ace, I check river and he goes all in, I would be pretty unhappy. Because in reality, what value hands do I beat, right? So that's going to be it for this little series of hands where we went through some of the hands I played deep in the $5,000 event. Unfortunately, I ended up busting in 6th place. So not what I wanted, but not so bad. For that finish, I believe I got 85,000, give or take, which usually makes for a pretty good World Series. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Jonathan Little, and also be sure to check back here on Poker News next week. We're going to be reviewing a hand from a $1,500 buy-in World Series of Poker event, so make sure you check that out. I want to thank all of you for being here for this video, and be sure to share it with your friends. I'll talk to you next time.